Hello, and welcome to this July edition of Book It. You're listening to Sign FM 102.6 on your radio dial and online at signfm.com. And in the writer spot, I'm very happy to welcome back Mr. Richard Pearse, currently of Stradbrook in, I believe, Suffolk, but formerly of Doncaster, who will be reading part of his story, The Unrecognised. This is Sheila North for Book It. And today, in the writer spot, I'm speaking once again to Richard Pearse, who's been in both, I believe, the writer and the author spot. Welcome back to Book It, Richard.
Thank you very much, Sheila. It's lovely to talk to you again after such a long time.
It has been a while. Now, I'm speaking to you by telephone. You're home at Stradbrook, have I got that right?
Stradbrook in Suffolk, the middle of nowhere.
But you're originally from Doncaster?
Yes, I am originally from Doncaster.
I'm not sure how we would categorize your writing, because, of course, your novel, Dead Man, is really quite romantic when you consider, number one, the subject, which is about a woman's obsession with a particular member of, I believe it was Scott's party. Yeah. And number two, forgive me for saying this, it was written by a bloke, of course.
Well, you see, that's... To address the genre thing first, my agent hates me because I hop genres like mad. So, you know, I've written an erotic thriller, which he didn't want to know about, but which has had good reviews on Amazon. And again, the surprise was that a bloke should write an erotic thriller with a very dominant female character. And I don't mean dominant as in BDSM or whatever it is, but just that she is the main character and not that the male drives the narrative. As far as Dead Men and the romance goes, you know, it's sort of historical fiction and a bit of a ghost story, but my view is romance leads all our lives anyway. Love is what redeems us in the end, if we're lucky enough to find it. And yeah, I was talking to one of my daughters in the car the other day, and I used to play hockey when I was at college, and I was a bit of a hard man. And people used to come to my room, and I'd have poems that I'd written stuck up on the walls everywhere. And people found it very strange that a bloke who was quite hard playing sport would be writing poetry and thought it was a bit of a Nancy thing to do. And I said, but why? Why can't I do both? Why can't I be competitive at sport and be a sensitive person?
Well, why not indeed? And it's almost as though people are saying we want real human beings to be one-dimensional, and yet that's one of the worst things you can do with characters in writing.
Absolutely. Coming back to Dead Men, the main character, Birdie, she's a painter and she's very moody. And, you know, at the beginning in the book, she's not actually a very likable character. She's quite horrible to the main male character. And lots of my readers who have taken time to get in touch with me say, oh, you know, I really hated Birdie right at the beginning, but I got to like her in the end. In fact, I've got a letter here in front of me, and it says, Richard loved Dead Men even though Birdie drove me mad. Got to like her by the end. Lost to love Jill, who is in Leeds. And by the way, this was not placed here because I knew you were phoning me. It's just a letter that I haven't quite got around to answering yet. So, you know, it's interesting. And you know, I've written sort of other historical fiction without necessarily a huge amount of romance in it, and women's fiction as well. And as I say, my agent doesn't quite understand why I'm like that, why I can't just write one type of book. But there is not just one type of life. We all lead different lives. So why not write, you know, lots of different types of books?
Indeed. And today, of course, you're in the writer's spot, and we're featuring your story, which I wanted to turn into The Understanding, but it's actually The Unrecognized.
Yes. And I mean, that again, you know, I think it's got a potential to be turned into a novel. and you and I agreed that, because the original short story is nearly 7,000 words long, which would take up most of your program, and I might be difficult and a diva, but I don't want to take up most of your program. And it is, again, something, I've always wanted to write a book without a plot, if you understand what I mean. Something where you're not turning the page to arrive at the final moment on the final page, but one where you can get lost in every moment on every page, and maybe even reread every page before you go to the next page. And to an extent, that was a sort of voyage of discovery, because I never believed that I could write short stories, and then 2-3 years ago I started writing quite a lot of short stories. And my view is that they can become novels in the fullness of time, or they can just be left as you know, what they are, which is just something for someone to spend half an hour reading and then have a lasting impression of it, but go off and do something else.
Well, there are some writers out there, or writers in the past, who are famous just really for their short stories. Raymond Carver, as far as I know, never wrote a full-length novel, but he's very well known for his short stories.
Yeah, I mean, my dad, when I was young, bought me a book which was a collection of only short stories by lots and lots of different writers. And in fact, 3 or 4 years ago, when I started thinking I should write short stories, to keep my writer's mind ticking over if I didn't have time or focus enough to write a full-length novel, I actually got that book off the shelf. I mean, it's in German, because we were living in Germany at the time, but that's irrelevant because it's the same whatever language you write. So before I started writing short stories, I actually read 4 or 5 of the stories out of this book, and it gave me some interesting direction, which this is, The Unrecognised is one of the outcomes.
I would almost say that The Unrecognised is almost like a late-in-life love letter to your dead wife and your living children.
Yeah, I think that's about right. And, you know, it is fairly autobiographical, I must admit. Now that I'm 56, I mean, I was 54 when I wrote it. Although my wife's 8 years younger than me, etc., you start thinking you've lived over half your life. And what is there to show for that life? And, you know, lots of people say, oh, Rich, you live in rural Suffolk, you've got a nice house, got a fairly good job, and you write, and you've had a book published, but that's not the point. The thing is, what's in our heads? What would I do if Marianne died before I did? How would I react? Would I be able to keep living? All this sort of stuff. And what writers do is we turn all that internal stuff into a universal truth. So I think The Unrecognised can be read as a story about any widower, any widow, if you like, who've spent a long time with a partner, who've, through their love, had 4 kids and are reflecting on their life. I mean, it's not me saying, oh, my life is over at 56. It's me thinking, what will I do, or what will I be doing if I do live to be 90? And how will I see life? Will I just be a crumpled old man in a residential home, or will I still have the energy and the drive to go and do other things?
Well, I think
it reflects... Sorry.
No, we all reflect on our potential future, but a writer is somebody who turns that into fiction.
Yes, I mean, because that's what we do, because we're cannibals. I keep saying to people who meet me, and I keep saying, you know, writers are cannibals of life, because someone might say something and it becomes a line in a book. Someone might do something and they become a character in a book. And not to make fun of them or to caricature them or to steal them, but we're storytellers. We describe what we see.
Of course.
And some people find that really weird, just like people think that the main character in a novel is a total reflection of the writer, when that's really far from the truth. I think every character in a book has part of a writer's character in them.
Even if it's the bits we normally wouldn't want to look at.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think writers probably have far more dark sides than people who don't write, or at least they show them more in different ways.
Like it or not.
Yes.
Richard, it's always lovely to speak to you, and I hope our listeners are looking forward to listening to The Unrecognized. It's a beautiful story.
Thank you ever so much, Sheila.
All stories are love stories. Some are just badly told or badly lived. He hadn't always been fat. He wasn't fat anymore. He'd just spent a whole lifetime imagining he was. Always, every minute of every day. Even when he could see his ribs in the mirror every morning when he shaved. Even when his wife told him he wasn't fat. He hadn't heard her voice for an age. 10 years, 3 months, 5 days, 6 hours, 10 minutes and 35 seconds to be precise. He liked precision deep down, although everyone around him thought he was chaotic and impulsive. The wrinkles in his face were deep now, unwanted old age carving unwanted pictures into his skin. He'd never yearned for old age, not on his own, had always expected to die before her, because she was 8 years younger than him. He managed to smile at the face looking out at him, his father's face. He hadn't expected to live this long after she'd gone either, had never anticipated the strength his body would have. Even when she'd been alive, even when they were relatively young and their children still dependent on them, he'd known with absolute certainty that he would never be able to survive without her. And here he was, almost 90, still smoking, still breathing, still lonely, still fat. 2 days of grey beard gave him a rakish look, he supposed. Perhaps that's what kept him alive, this unquenchable thirst to see himself in a better light than he could, the hope that one day, for just one day, he'd be able to accept himself as he was, see himself as he really was. Looked at from the outside, he was a wiry man now, not a spare ounce of food on him, nothing that shook and shivered when he jumped up and down, everything as taut as straining cable. Everyone could see it except him. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. "I know you can see me," he said. "I wish I could see you." The bedroom was the same as the day he'd woken up to find her next to him, lifeless, with the smile of sleep on her rigid face. Her nightshirt was there, carelessly crushed into a shapeless heap on her pillow. He'd changed the sheets uncounted times, of course, but not the pillow cover, not the nightshirt, always carrying it, like fragile papyrus, across to the chest of drawers while he did his domestic chores, careful to wash everything with the same detergent she had used, and the same fabric conditioner. That way, everything smelled the same as it always had when she was alive. Now he sat down on the bed next to the shirt, bent to take a breath of what was left of her scent, and stared out of the window down into the village street. His friend opposite had died 2 or 3 years ago, the one who'd lived in this house until he was 19. He shrugged. "We should have been enjoying this," he said, the nightshirt now in his hands, in his arms, drooping like a sleeping baby. "Just you and me together, one last long evening." There was a bitterness in his whisper. So much for faith. He put the fabric back into its place and stood up. There was an irony in his ease of movement. In his 50s he'd often struggled with his bad back. The radio started blaring out a tune he didn't recognize. He put his shirt on in time to the music. He'd always liked new bands, new songs, the louder the better, the more political the better. Songs of the human condition. He looked in the wardrobe mirror. Her clothes were still behind its door. The children had tried to persuade him to throw them out, or to share them out amongst them and his grandchildren, but he refused. "When I'm gone," he said, "then the boys and girls can choose what they want to keep and what not." There had been no contradiction. They were still afraid of him, he supposed, although they knew really that he was the softest man of all men, the softest of all people, even softer than she had been. Downstairs, spring sun had already warmed the kitchen. It was odd, every morning, unerringly, not to have to watch his words, not to have to pander to anyone who was bad in the mornings. He enjoyed it, to be able to say what he wanted, to do what he wanted, without being hit with a warning look or a sharp word, or forced to skirt around difficult issues he always thought honesty could have solved in an instance. But the emptiness was more difficult to cope with than the silence he filled by turning on yet another radio. The round table was scratched and worn. He didn't polish it like she had, didn't even attempt to make it look like new. He just lived with it, and he wanted every wrinkle in his life to be reflected in every scratch on the table. When their children and grandchildren came to visit, he didn't stop them from drawing on the table. "That's what it's for," he'd say. "It's just a thicker version of paper." His children shook their heads. "You never said that to us." "That's because I was scared of your mother," he said. "She always wanted everything just so. Perfect." The pigmentation on his hands irritated him. They were old man's hands, and he hated that. Even though they were still strong, they were old and looked old. He laid his hands flat on the table in front of him, and the warmth and strength of the pine rose up into him through his palms. "What shall we do today?" He cocked his head as if listening. "I could go for a walk. I could just stay here and make that list I've been promising myself to make for years." The only change he'd made to the kitchen was to hang a photograph of her up on the blackboard she'd made all those decades ago. There was still chalk writing on it, right at the top, from when their oldest had gone to university, a poem about a man chasing the horizon and never catching it. The white was wearing a bit thin now, and was irrelevant anyway. The boy had caught his horizon, and so had the girls. The important thing was the photo. Her eyes followed him everywhere, and the tightness of her body reminded him of his own youth, of when he first met her, of all the doubting years between then and when she'd gone, and the question he'd asked himself every day. Why, of all the women he had loved he loved her the best, the longest, the fiercest? "You're the only person I want to be with when I die," he told her when he asked her to marry him. Was that reason enough? And that's not what had happened anyway. Who would he die with now? Alone, probably. The coffee in the tiny cup was still warm. He'd started drinking coffee again when all the children had left home, after he'd been without for 20 years. He'd started buying proper coffee, not the instant muck that had made him so ill he thought he would die. He raised the cup to the photograph, met her eyes. Unadulterated pumpkin, black, no sugar, the way it's supposed to be drunk. He told her this every morning. A meow, sharp over the noise of the radio, brought him to his feet. "You're just like all the others," he said to the fourth Florence he'd looked after, a tiny black cat just like all her predecessors. "You should learn to use the cat flap. I'm tired of clearing up after you every day." The cat stroked herself against his legs, meowed, and sat down again, tail lashing impatiently on the limestone tiles. "Go on then," he said, took the keys from their rack, opened one half of the French windows out onto the decking, and hooked it into place. "There you are. Go have some fun." He stepped out and the cat followed him. He rummaged in his trouser pockets for his pre-rolled cigarettes and his lighter, moved one of the wooden chairs to be pedantically straight in line with the sun, and sat down. The first taste of smoke every morning was still one of his unalloyed pleasures, and he was proud of the fact that he hadn't started to smoke in the house, even after he had become a widower. He listened to the birds, the creaking of the trees, watched the silver birch sway in the slight breeze, the tree she'd planted all those years ago, grown from a tender, fragile sapling threatened by bugs and grass and weeds, to the tall, slender shelter from the summer sun it was now. If he'd see the next summer, that was.
I hope you've enjoyed this July edition of Book It, and I do hope you'll tune in next month on Saturday, the 27th of August at 10 a.m. That's Saturday, the 27th of August at 10 a.m. here on Sign FM for the next edition of the show, when I'm very happy to welcome to the writer's spot local poet Dan Ryder. For now, it's time for the Urban Music Mix Show with DJ Deluxe. Until next month.
Every day is hot with Sign FM, bringing you the biggest music variety ever. This is 102.6 Sign FM. Streaming live at signfm.com.